Chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society, the greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father, and though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms, without forming at it any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head, living in retirement, and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when the living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank, and his veneration for her as his patroness, mingling with a very good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman, and his right as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility. Having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. This was his plan of amends, of atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessively generous and disinterested on his own part. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views, and established all his strictest notions of what was due to seniority, and for the first evening she was his settled choice. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his parsonage house, and leading naturally to the avowal of his hopes that a mistress might be found for it at Longbourn, produced from her, amid very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane he had fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take upon her to say. She could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she must just mention, she felt it incumbent on her to hint, was likely to be very soon engaged. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her of course. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint, and trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go with her, and Mr. Collins was to attend them, at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him, and have his library to himself. For thither Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, nominally engaged with one of the largest folios in the collection, but really talking to Mr. Bennet, with little cessation, of his house and garden at Hunsford. Such doings discomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. In his library he had always been sure of leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room of the house, he was used to be free from them there. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to join his daughters in their walk, and Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely pleased to close his large book and go. In pompous nothings on his side, and civil assents on that of his cousins, their time passed till they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was then no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up in the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window, could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man, whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanly-like appearance, walking with another officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air, all wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined if possible to find out, led the way across the street, under the pretence of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the 2 gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly, and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and he was happy to say had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favour. He had all the best part of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party was still standing and talking together very agreeably when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly toward them and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger, and Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour. One looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not to long to know. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, but without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips's house, and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they should come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips's throwing up the parlour window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest, from their recent absence, were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she would have known nothing about, if she had not happened to see Mr. Jones's shop-boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more drafts to Netherfield because the Miss Bennets were come away, when her civility was claimed toward Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him. She received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion, without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself, however, might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to her notice. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put to an end by exclamations and inquiries about the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the shire. She had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would have certainly continued the occupation, but unluckily no one passed windows now except for a few of the officers, who, in comparison with the stranger, were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham and give him an invitation also, if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets, and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies in quitting the room, and was assured with unwearying civility that they were perfectly needless. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen, but though Jane would have defended either or both, had they appeared to be in the wrong, she could no more explain such behaviour than her sister. Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He protested that, except for Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she not only received him with the utmost civility, but even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before. Something, he supposed, might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. Chapter 16. As no objection was made to the young people's engagement with their aunt, and all Mr. Collins's scruples of leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bennet for a single evening during his visit were most steadily resisted, the coach conveyed him and his 5 cousins at a suitable hour to Meryton, and the girls had the pleasure of hearing, as they entered the drawing-room, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation, and was then in the house. When all this information was given, and they had all taken their seats, Mr. Collins was at leisure to look around him and admire. He was so much struck with the size and furniture of the apartment that he declared he might almost have supposed himself in the small summer breakfast parlour at Rosings, a comparison that did not at first convey much gratification. But when Mrs. Phillips understood from him what Rosings was, and who was its proprietor, when she had listened to the description of only one of Lady Catherine's drawing-rooms, and found that the chimney-piece alone had cost £800, she felt all the force of the compliment, and would hardly have resented a comparison with the housekeeper's room. In describing to her all the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her mansion, with occasional digressions in praise of his own humble abode and the improvements it was receiving, he was happily employed until the gentleman joined them, and he found in Mrs. Phillips a very attentive listener, whose opinion of his consequence increased with what she heard, and who was resolving to retail it all among her neighbours as soon as she could. To the girls, who could not listen to their cousin, and who had nothing to do but to wish for an instrument and examine their own indifferent imitations of china on the mantelpiece, the interval of waiting appeared very long. It was over at last, however. The gentleman did approach, and when Mr. Wickham walked into the room, Elizabeth felt she had neither been seeing him before nor thinking of him since, with the smallest degree of unreasonable admiration. The officers of the shire were in general a very creditable, gentlemanlike set, and the best of them were of the present party. But Mr. Wickham was as far beyond them all in person, countenance, air, and walk, as they were superior to the broad-faced, stuffy Uncle Phillips, breathing port wine, who followed them into the room. Mr. Wickham was the happy man towards whom almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself, and the agreeable manner in which he immediately fell into conversation, though it was only on its being a wet night, made her feel that the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic might be rendered interesting by the skill of the speaker. With such rivals for the notice of the fair as Mr. Wickham and the officers, Mr. Collins seemed to sink into insignificance. To the young ladies he certainly was nothing, but he had still at intervals a kind listener in Mrs. Phillips, and was by her watchfulness most abundantly supplied with coffee and muffin. When the card tables were placed, he had the opportunity of obliging her in turn by sitting down to whist. "I know little of the game at present," said he, "but I shall be glad to improve myself, for in my situation in life—" Mrs. Phillips was very glad for his compliance, but could not wait for his reason. Mr. Wickham did not play at whist, and with ready delight was he received at the other table between Elizabeth and Lydia. At first there seemed danger of Lydia's engrossing him entirely, for she was a most determined talker, but being likewise extremely fond of lottery tickets, she soon grew too much interested in the game, too eager in making bets and exclaiming after prizes to have attention for anyone in particular. Allowing for the common demands of the game, Mr. Wickham was therefore at leisure to talk to Elizabeth, and she was very willing to hear him, though what she chiefly wished to hear she could not hope to be told, the history of his acquaintance with Mr. Darcy. She dared not even mention that gentleman. Her curiosity, however, was unexpectedly relieved. Mr. Wickham began the subject himself. He inquired how far Netherfield was from Meryton, and, after receiving her answer, asked in a hesitating manner how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "About a month," said Elizabeth, and then, unwilling to let the subject drop, added, "He is a man of very large property in Derbyshire, I understand." "Yes," replied Mr. Wickham. "His estate there is a noble one, a clear 10,000 per annum. You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you certain information on that head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a particular manner from my infancy." Elizabeth could not but look surprised. "You may well be surprised, Miss Bennet, at such an assertion, after seeing, as you probably might, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Are you much acquainted with Mr. Darcy?" "As much as I ever wished to be," cried Elizabeth very warmly. "I have spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I think him very disagreeable." "I have no right to give my opinion," said Wickham, "as to his being agreeable or otherwise. I am not qualified to form one. I have known him too long and too well to be a fair judge. It is impossible for me to be impartial. But I believe your opinion of him would in general astonish, and perhaps you would not express it quite so strongly anywhere else. Here you are in your own family." "Upon my word, I say no more here than I might say in any house in the neighbourhood, except Netherfield. He is not at all liked in Hertfordshire. Everybody is disgusted with his pride. You will not find him more favourably spoken of by anyone." "I cannot pretend to be sorry," said Wickham after a short interruption, "that he or that any man should not be estimated beyond their deserts, but with him I believe it does not often happen. The world is blinded by his fortune in consequence, or frightened by his high and imposing manners, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen." "I should take him, even on my slight acquaintance, to be an ill-tempered man." Wickham only shook his head. "I wonder," said he at the next opportunity of speaking, "whether he is likely to be in this country much longer." "I do not know it all, but I heard nothing of his going away when I was at Netherfield. I hope your plans in favour of the Blankshire will not be affected by his being in the neighbourhood." "Oh, no. It is not for me to be driven away by Mr. Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. We are not on friendly terms, and it always gives me pain to meet him, but I have no reason for avoiding him, but what I might proclaim before all the world, a sense of very great ill-usage, and most painful regrets at his being what he is. His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend I ever had, and I can never be in company with this Mr. Darcy without being grieved to the soul by 1,000 tender recollections. His behaviour to myself has been scandalous, but I verily believe I could forgive him anything and everything, rather than his disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father." Elizabeth found the interest of the subject increase, and listened with all her heart, but the delicacy of it prevented further inquiry. Mr. Wickham began to speak on more general topics. Meryton, the neighbourhood, the society, appearing highly pleased with all that he had yet seen, and speaking of the latter with gentle but very intelligible gallantry. "It was the prospect of constant society and good society," he added, "which was my chief inducement to enter the Blankshire. I knew it to be a most respectable, agreeable corps, and my friend Denny tempted me further by his account of their present quarters, and the very great attentions and excellent acquaintances Meryton had procured them. Society, I own, is necessary to me. I've been a disappointed man, and my spirits will not bear solitude. I must have employment and society. A military life is not what I was intended for, but circumstances have now made it eligible. The church ought to have been my profession. I was brought up for the church, and I should at this time have been in possession of a most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman we were speaking of just now." "Indeed?" "Yes. The late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation of the best living in his gift. He was my godfather, and excessively attached to me. I cannot do justice to his kindness. He meant to provide for me amply, and thought he had done it, but when the living fell, it was given elsewhere." "Good heavens!" cried Elizabeth. "But how could that be? How could his will be disregarded? Why did you not seek legal redress?" "There was just such an informality in the terms of the bequest as to give me no hope from law. A man of honour could not have doubted the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, or to treat it as merely a conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claim to it by extravagance, impudence, in short, anything or nothing. Certain it is that the living became vacant 2 years ago, exactly as I was of an age to hold it, and that it was given to another man, and no less certain is it that I cannot accuse myself of having really done anything to deserve to lose it. I have a warm, unguarded temper, and I may have spoken my opinion of him and to him too freely. I can recall nothing worse, but the fact is that we are very different sort of men, and that he hates me." "This is quite shocking. He deserves to be publicly disgraced." "Some time or other he will be, but it shall not be by me. Till I can forget his father, I can never defy or expose him." Elizabeth honoured him for such feelings, and thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed them. "But what," said she after a pause, "can have been his motive? What can have induced him to behave so cruelly?" "A thorough determined dislike of me, a dislike which I cannot but attribute in some measure to jealousy. Had the late Mr. Darcy liked me less, his son might have borne with me better. But his father's uncommon attachment to me irritated him, I believe, very early in life. He had not a temper to bear the sort of competition in which we stood, the sort of preference which was often given to me. I had not thought Mr. Darcy so bad as this. Though I have never liked him, I had not thought so very ill of him. I'd supposed him to be despising his fellow creatures in general, but did not suspect him of descending to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this. After a few minutes' reflection, however, she continued, I do remember his boasting one day at Netherfield of the implacability of his resentments, of his having an unforgiving temper. His disposition must be dreadful. I will not trust myself on the subject, replied Wickham. I can hardly be just to him. Elizabeth was again deep in thought, and after a time exclaimed, To treat in such a manner the godson, the friend, the favourite of his father. She could have added, a young man too, like you, whose very countenance may vouch for your being amiable, but she contented herself with, and one too who had probably been his companion from childhood, connected together, as I think you said, in the closest manner. We were born in the same parish, within the same park. The greatest part of our youth was passed together, inmates of the same house, sharing the same amusements, objects of the same parental care. My father began life in the profession which your uncle, Mr. Phillips, appears to do much credit to, but he gave up everything to be of use to the late Mr. Darcy, and devoted all his time to the care of the Pemberley property. He was most highly esteemed by Mr. Darcy, a most intimate, confidential friend. Mr. Darcy often acknowledged himself to be under the greatest obligations to my father's active superintendence, and when, immediately before my father's death, Mr. Darcy gave him a voluntary promise of providing for me, I'm convinced he felt it to be as much a debt of gratitude to him as of his affection to myself. How strange! Cried Elizabeth. How abominable! I wonder that the very pride of this Mr. Darcy has not made him just to you, if from no better motive, that he should not have been too proud to be dishonest. For dishonesty I must call it. It is wonderful, replied Wickham, for almost all his actions may be traced to pride, and pride had often been his best friend. It has connected him nearer with virtue than with any other feeling. But we are none of us consistent, and in his behaviour to me there were stronger impulses even than pride. Can such abominable pride as his have ever done him good? Yes, it has often led him to be liberal and generous, to give his money freely, to display hospitality, to assist his tenants and relieve the poor. Family pride and filial pride, for he is very proud of what his father was, have done this, not to appear to disgrace his family, to degenerate from the popular qualities, or lose the influence of the Pemberley house as a powerful motive. He also has brotherly pride, which, with some brotherly affection, makes him a very kind and careful guardian of his sister, and you will hear him generally cried up as the most attentive and best of brothers. What sort of girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. I wish I could call her amiable. It gives me pain to speak ill of a Darcy, but she is too much like her brother, very, very proud. As a child she was affectionate and pleasing, and extremely fond of me, and I have devoted hours and hours to her amusement. But she's nothing to me now. She's a handsome girl, about 15 or 16, and, I understand, highly accomplished. Since her father's death her home has been London, where a lady lives with her, and superintends her education. After many pauses and many trials of other subjects, Elizabeth could not help reverting once more to the first, and saying, I am astonished at his intimacy with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seems good humour itself, and is, I really believe, truly amiable, be in friendship with such a man? How can they suit each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley? Not at all. He is a sweet-tempered, amiable, charming man. He cannot know what Mr. Darcy is. Probably not, But Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He does not want abilities. He can be a conversible companion if he thinks it worth his while. Among those who are at his equals in consequence, he is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. His pride never deserts him, but with the rich he is liberal-minded, just, sincere, rational, honourable, and perhaps agreeable, allowing something for fortune in figure. The whist party soon afterwards breaking up, the players gathered round the other table, and Mr. Collins took his station between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success were made by the latter. It had not been very great. He had lost every point. But when Mrs. Phillips began to express her concern thereupon, he assured her with much earnest gravity that it was not of the least importance, that he considered the money as a mere trifle, and begged that she would not make herself uneasy. "I know very well, madam," said he, "that when persons sit down to a card-table, they must take their chances of these things, and happily I am not in such circumstances as to make 5 shillings any object. There are undoubtedly many who could not say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, I am removed far beyond the necessity of regarding little matters." Mr. Wickham's attention was caught, and, after observing Mr. Collins for a few moments, he asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relation was very intimately acquainted with the family of de Bourgh. "Lady Catherine de Bourgh," she replied, "has very lately given him a living. I hardly know how Mr. Collins was first introduced to her notice, but he certainly has not known her long." "You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, consequently that she is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy." "No, indeed, I did not. I knew nothing at all of Lady Catherine's connections. I never heard of her existence till the day before yesterday." "Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it is believed that she and her cousin will unite the 2 estates." This information made Elizabeth smile as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Vain indeed must be all her attentions, vain and useless her affection for his sister and her praise of himself, if he was already self-destined for another. "Mr. Collins," said she, "speaks highly of both Lady Catherine and her daughter, but from some particulars that he has related of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant, conceited woman." "I believe her to be both in a great degree," replied Wickham. "I have not seen her for many years, but I very well remember that I never liked her, and that her manners were dictatorial and insolent. She has the reputation of being remarkably sensible and clever, but I rather believe she derives part of her abilities from her rank and fortune, part from her authoritative manner, and the rest from the pride of her nephew, who chooses that everyone connected with him should have an understanding of the first class." Elizabeth allowed that he had given a very rational account of it, and they continued talking together with mutual satisfaction till supper put an end to cards and gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attentions. There could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party, but his manners recommended him to everybody. Whatever he said was said well, and whatever he did, done gracefully. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. She could think of nothing but of Mr. Wickham, and of what he had told her, all the way home. But there was not time for her even to mention his name as they went, for neither Lydia nor Mr. Collins were once silent. Lydia talked incessantly of lottery tickets, of the fish she had lost and the fish she had won, and Mr. Collins, in describing the civility of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, protesting that he did not in the least regard his losses at whist, enumerating all the dishes at supper, and repeatedly fearing that he crowded his cousins, had more to say than he could well manage before the carriage stopped at Longbourn House.
Lots has happened.
A lot has happened. Since we didn't discuss the last one, we're talking about all 4 chapters.
Yeah, why not? They were kind of a blitz of things.
I feel like they all kind of
go together
very well, because it's all introducing, really, Mr. Collins. And what is wrong with him? Didn't they say he has, like, no formal education or something, and he's all about the church?
He's a clergyman.
He doesn't like to read books. Red flag there. Yeah, so Mr. Collins, and we find out that who is, I I thought she was his wife at first.
She's just a very wealthy, elite,
What was her name?
noblewoman. Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
Yes, so Lady Catherine. At first I thought they were like a thing, but apparently not. Because I kind of overlooked it in the first chapter. Realized later on, like, he's there to marry one of his cousins.
Yeah.
You didn't tell me this was inspired by Game of Thrones.
Or maybe Game of Thrones was inspired by it.
Maybe. I mean, it has to work that way. I was just joking here. But, God, why?
Because then if he marries one of his cousins, then the estate and everything could be all kept together, I think.
Well, I get the financial security in it, but...
Well, how messed up is
yuck.
it? How messed up is it that he gets all of the property and everything, and the daughters get nothing?
Well, I mean, it's messed up, but not surprising for this time period. But yuck!
Yeah, yuck. Very yuck.
I thought
Much gross.
You know, for the time period, I thought we moved past this incest thing. But apparently not.
You know, for humanity being as progressive as it is, I think on the whole, we still have not moved past the incest thing.
No. You're not, no. I'm going to live in blissful ignorance. I don't care what the facts are on this. I am going to believe that it is not a thing that happens.
Happens all the time.
I'm not going to believe it. Blissful ignorance here. I'm a man of facts, as you have seen many times on this channel. But that is one thing where I will not accept any facts if they contradict my beliefs on this. I will not allow my brain to think about this. It is fine. Nothing is happening. It is only in Game of Thrones where this happens. There we go. Moving on. Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham seems... I can't quite put my finger on Mr. Wickham. I don't know whether he is... I don't know who to believe. Like, is Wickham just salty about something? And, like, hates Mr. Darcy? Or did Mr. Darcy really
actually act like
screw
a
him
douchebag
over like that?
Mm.
I feel like for the story's sake, he should probably be the douchebag, and Darcy's gonna be like, actually, went down like this. He's just lying to you. And then Elizabeth is going to be, like, conflicted. No, Mr. Darcy couldn't be the good person in this situation.
She's really taken with Wickham, though.
I know.
She, like, really likes him.
That's what makes me think that he must be lying. There must be something wrong, because we're too early in the story for her to fall madly in love with this man and happily ever after. Unless, of course, the rest of the story is like the conflict of her trying to be with Mr. Wickham and
no one
and
like being okay
Mr.
with it.
Collins trying to woo her, I guess.
First of all, Mr. Collins is so annoying, but he cracks me up.
He's great.
So ridiculous. He doesn't shut up.
I know.
He just doesn't stop. And he talks about Lady Catherine so much. And he's just so obvious when he's trying to, like... He even says, like, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to flatter this person and blah, 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 and debase myself in front of them as befitting of my rank. And, blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, dude, oh my god.
It's like, oh, I'm so wealthy. Oh, that amount of money is nothing for me to lose in cards.
Like, when he finds out that Darcy is...
bringing in 10,000.
Oh, that he's connected to Lady Catherine.
Oh yeah.
She's...
Well, Mr. Collins doesn't find that out. Elizabeth finds that out from Mr. Wickham.
Right. But doesn't she say something about it to Mr. Collins, and then they go to the ball, or is that in chapter 18?
It must be later on, because I haven't gotten there yet.
Okay. Never mind.
Scratch that. Unless it totally went over my head because I was focused on something else in the chapter.
No, there was a ball. If you haven't gotten to the ball yet, then then just cut that out then.
Next time on Pride and Prejudice.
Forget I said anything.
The ball.
But here's the question. What's going to happen next with Jane and Mr. Bingley?
They're going to get married and live happily ever after. The end.
And Elizabeth is going to get married to Mr. Collins and live happily ever after?
Half right. She's going to get married to him. Happily. Question. At least he'll have a lot of money.
So...
I mean, I guess Elizabeth can't complain. Well, I mean, unless she's with Mr. Wickham, because apparently he's broke.
But he's handsome.
Hey.
And incredibly charming. Like,
who cares about any other aspects of a person? As long as they're cute.
So you're not sure how you feel about Mr. Wickham. You're like, I'm not sure about this dude.
I haven't gotten enough
information.
And we've seen how fake people are.
That's true.
And it's also just so early on in the story. I feel like it can't just be that Elizabeth falls in love with Wickham and that's it. And then it's, I don't know. Unless it's really just going to be that and then the struggle with Mr. Collins. But why have Mr. Darcy in it at all, if that's the case? So it's got to be that Wickham is a douchebag. And he deserves everything he got. And he's trying to belittle Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy is going to hit him with some, actually, here you go, the evidence. You lying piece of garbage.
But Elizabeth is
Elizabeth is going to be like, no, but he's so handsome, and you're a meanie.
She is pretty ready to believe everything that comes out of Wickham's mouth.
Yeah.
And then you've got her sisters who are just like, oh, men in uniform, I'm wet. Like, the whole time.
I know, every time we talk about them, they're going to the guard station.
Yeah. That's it.
Or they didn't do anything today because it was raining and they couldn't make it to the guard station.
Yes. That's it. That is
Jesus. How boring is this town?
I think this is why Mr. Bennet is in his library all the time.
I mean, I would be too.
Yeah. And why Elizabeth is his favorite child.
Yeah, that's true.
It makes a lot of sense. So yeah, Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham, new characters. Yay!
Yeah, this is going to be interesting.
I love Mr. Collins. He's just so much. He just makes me laugh.
I think your Vernon Dursley voice on him fits very well.
Yeah, when I was getting to that point where we introduced him, I thought, oh my god. Yeah, I gotta do it this way. It fits. Oh, just wait till the next couple chapters. He feels like he belongs in The Office because of the levels of awkward and cringe that he creates. It's just like, ooh, dude, just stop. You're putting your foot way too far into your mouth.
I mean, everything he's done so far, especially when he was, like, reading to them.
Oh my god, I know.
Was it Lydia started talking?
Yeah.
He was just offended.
He was so... offended. Wasn't he reading them something religious?
Yeah.
He was really reading something religious, and then Lydia would
If
just...
someone doesn't want to listen, even when it's written solely for their benefit.
Yeah.
Like, oh god.
Dude, she's like 13. Chill out. However old Lydia's supposed to be, I don't know. 14 maybe. I'm not really sure how old Lydia's supposed to be. Either way, she's a teenage girl. You are reading her a religious text.
Either way, I don't like Mr. Collins.
Oh, I don't like him, but he's great for the story.
Oh, he is. Mr. Wickham, I don't know about. He seems a little fishy.
Is he fishy in the same way that you thought Bingley was fishy? Or are you, like, firmly on the, like, Bingley's a good dude train?
No. I'm leaning more towards that.
Mm.
But Wickham seems really fishy. Mr. Bingley was just kind of a 50-50 shot. Wickham, I feel like it's 70-30.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then Darcy, firmly believe he's a douchebag. But I think we're going to find out that he's not the biggest of the douchebags.
Ah, okay. He's the least douchiest of the bags?
He is douchey, but he's honest about his douchiness, and everyone else just covers up their douchiness.
Ah, I see. Okay.
So, there it is.
Alright.
So that's it. That's the characters.
What about Mrs. Bennet? Is she a douche?
I don't even know about Mrs. Bennet. She's just misguided? Too much time on her hands? I don't know. She needs a hobby. Is what she needs.
She needs a hobby. Alright, maybe. Maybe that's her trouble.
Collect stamps. Just, I don't know. Learn to knit.
She probably knows how to knit.
I don't know. It seems like all she does is gossip and try to get her daughters married.
That's what she does. That is what she does.
I mean, I kind of understand once we hear, like, Lydia and everyone speaking and all that. Maybe Mr. Bennet isn't the only one who has the issue. She's like, get these children out of my house.
Maybe.
Done with this. You're 14. Get yourself a man. Move out.
Maybe. Maybe she can't take it either. Although she does say, like, she loves Lydia and Kitty. And finds Elizabeth very frustrating.
Yeah, but she's their mother. She's got to say that.
Yeah, but Elizabeth is, like, the least annoying of all of them.
Well, yes, in a way, but she's also the most annoying because she contradicts what her mother says.
Well, then Jane should be her favorite.
I'm pretty sure Jane is. Jane is doing everything that she wants. She doesn't argue. She found a man and is working her way up there. Like, that's pride and joy.
Alright. Maybe you're right. Either way,
I guess join us next time for The Ball.
At Netherfield.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can head over to our Patreon or check out some of the official Bibliobibuli merch. If you're new here, consider subscribing, and until the next video, happy reading.